This is Vinny Lore, and this is a history of Namibia. An introduction to Namibia. It is a fairly large country on the southwestern portion of Africa. It is quite large. It has about 3 million people, and it is unfortunately mostly desert, so most of it is uninhabitable. However, the eastern coast is a lush green natural reserve, as reserved by the government. It has a long history with people first moving in 30,000 years ago, although the written history only starts in the late 1850s. However, we do know that the people who lived there did set up several small kingdoms, especially along this northern area, and did have a vibrant society. The first European contact with Namibia occurred in the 15th century with the Portuguese explorers Bartolomeu Dias and Diego Cao arriving in Walvis Bay and Cape Cross. Beyond that, there wasn't much contact between Europeans and Namibia until the Dutch and Norwegian and British missionaries started coming in around the late 1700s and early 1800s. That's not to say that they didn't indirectly affect the fate of this place, of Namibia, before then. The Orloms are one such example. They were a Christian ethnicity made from a mix of native Africans, Dutch settlers, Indonesian, and Indian servants from the colonies. They were Christian and they were militarily and culturally European, and they were kicked out by the Dutch and the British from their homes somewhere down here. When the British were setting up the Cape Colony, they were forced upwards into Namibia, where they set out on a year, several decades long war with the native tribes there. Obviously, they were successful. They had guns. The natives didn't have guns at this time, I believe. And they set up their own red state here. It was called the Red State. And the protracted state of war that they found themselves in with the native tribes was essentially what the Europeans, specifically the Germans, found when they came into the place.
Schön war die Zeit für uns in Afrika, doch diese Zeit ist lange her.
Note, the scramble for Africa was prefixed by the Berlin Conference, which determined the rules for which this colonization of Africa would take place. And so the Germans were left to colonize Cameroon, Tanganyika, Togo, and Southwest Africa. The problem with all of this was that it was mostly desert or dense rainforest, which the Germans didn't have much use for. But they did colonize the area, and in 1884, the Germans colonized, or at least claimed, Namibia, and they set up administrative centers on the coast of the Atlantic seaboard of Namibia, while the British, they seized Walvis Bay in the same year. It's over here, it's an enclave. It was a pretty nice port for British ships heading down to South Africa and around the Horn to India and Australia, as well as New Zealand. Later in the later 1880s, all the way up till about 1910, after the Germans had colonized the initial seaboard, they started pushing it into the interior of Namibia and setting up their colonial, administrative, and economic presence there. However, obviously the natives didn't like this, and they've been resisting all along. And in about 1904, this went out into a full revolt when the Herero tribe, they went and they attacked several German settlers, homesteaders, as well as several German forts, and they unfortunately managed to kill about 100 people. The German government retaliated by sending in colonial troops from Germany, and in the ensuing incident, they killed about 80% of the Herero and a similar percent of the Nama tribe. This incident would only end once the tribes were pushed all the way to British-controlled Botswana, which was back then called Bechuanaland. And that was pretty much the state German Southwest Africa found itself right before World War I, which started in 1914. Initially, even though Germany itself was doing quite well, its colonies were rather quickly taken over, especially in the Pacific and African areas. And Southwest Africa in particular was colonized or taken over by British South Africa, which was a dominion of the British Empire in 1915. Life under South Africa was a bit different from life under Germany, but both were pretty racist. The South African government did end up setting up several Bantustans, is what they called it, to try to isolate the native African populace from the native white population. Africans really didn't like this, or they didn't really heed it very much because they flocked to cities for better work opportunities. But even in the cities, a rigid system of, as you'll know it by the name of apartheid, was formed, which did segregate the two races. The Africans did not take this standing down, though, and in the early 1960s, SWAPO was formed. This party, though banned by the South African government, claimed to be the legal representation of the natives of South Africa. And in 1966, the UN recognized it as such and demanded Namibian independence from South Africa. In 1969, to accelerate this goal, they formed their military plan, which did fight with Angola in its border war against apartheid Africa. South Africa suffered in this border war with Angola in the late 1980s is, along with Nelson Mandela's agitation movement in South Africa, credited for toppling the apartheid regime. In 1989, a transition government was set up to liberate Namibia, and by 1990, it had its first functioning independent native government. Today, Namibia is one of the most vibrant and thriving countries within the continent of Africa. However, there are still several problems that plague it, including huge wealth inequalities and poverty rates. However, largely it is a success story with a booming economy and really a little racial tension within the country, which is quite surprising when you look over at its neighbor, South Africa. Overall, Namibia is a wonder story that should be praised as an example for the rest of Africa to look to as a new modern nation. Thank you.